Welcome to the State Network podcast. I'm Jim Sparks, and I'm here with Commissioner Kenneth Hodder, leader of the Western Territory. Hello, Commissioner.
Hi, Jim. It's great to be here with you today.
Commissioner will be taking up a new role in a little over a month, July 1, is that right?
July 1.
July 1. He will be the National Commander of the Salvation Army in the United States. What does the National Commander do?
Oh, there are all sorts of things that the National Office handles. I suppose my primary responsibilities could be divided into three parts. The first is to represent the Salvation Army at the federal level, working with the White House, working with Congress, ensuring that the Salvation Army is a part of those conversations that will affect our operations nationally. Second part, I think, has to do with the National Advisory Board, those key corporate and business and educational leaders from across the country who advise the Salvation Army on its overall strategy. The National Commander is responsible for maintaining and developing those relationships. And the third opportunity is really to coordinate the operations of the four territories, to chair the Commissioners' Conference, which is the senior policy-making body for the Army in this country.
Nice. And you will get to meet pretty neat people along the way.
Well, you know, I have had a chance in the role that I'm currently in to meet a lot of terrific people, a lot of people in places that surprised me who knew and loved the Salvation Army. And I think that's going to simply play out over and over again when I go to national. The legislators that I've met already in Washington speak to me about their own personal experiences with the Salvation Army. And that's a great delight, a great honor, and quite frankly, a great responsibility for the Army as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always been fascinating to me when someone has a touch point with the Salvation Army and how it sticks with them. And the weird part is it doesn't even have to be just with them. It could have been with grandma, grandpa, aunt, and uncle.
Oh, absolutely. I was at a meeting at the White House, I guess it was 2 months ago. And the staff came in, and they were all seated there, and we were starting our discussion. The first thing the key person said to me was that they had been a boy in West Virginia and couldn't have been more grateful to the Salvation Army for the help that the Salvation Army gave to his mom, who was unemployed and a single parent. So you hear these things, you don't expect them, but then when they come up, you think, wow, what a powerful impact the Army has.
Yeah, and it really speaks to the saints, that are working tirelessly and local levels all across the world and the great love that they have for people.
You're grateful for everything that's gone before. You know that none of it has been wasted. And you just pray, dear Lord, make us as faithful today as they were then.
Yeah. Amen to that. Well, we are certainly going to miss both you and Commissioner Jolene.
Oh, yes.
And so we're going to miss you guys, but
I have to take her with me, Jim.
I know.
Right.
I'm going to, here's the good news is I go to national headquarters once or twice a year. So I will be able to stop by.
Terrific.
I don't really understand I don't know if that's good news for you, but it's more of a heads up than anything at this point.
I'll be busy that day, Jim.
So, but if this is your last appointment, which it possibly could be.
Yes.
Is there an appointment that you kind of wish you always had or a location?
You know, I've always disciplined myself not to develop a sense of where I would want to be or where I would want to live. And that's because I've heard too many stories of individuals who had those dreams and those thoughts, and they didn't come true.
Yeah.
And it's a source of disappointment. For my wife and for me, we have always been surprised. We've always been pleased. So, no, I don't think I could ever say that if I retired from this position that I would regret not having served in a particular location or a particular role. Every place the Salvation Army has sent us has helped us to grow. We felt that we've had an impact, and for that, we can be truly grateful.
Nice. That's probably very, very good advice. It's very safe, and so you're limiting your disappointment levels.
Well, that's true.
Which is not bad advice.
Well, when you serve the Lord, there really is no disappointment associated with it. You put
True.
Your life in the hands of God, and wherever He leads, you have the faith to believe that He's going to be able to maximize it for His glory.
Yeah. Yeah, true. And I bet when you were in Kenya, you're like, well, yep, all right, here we go.
That's right. That's exactly right. And we grew to love it.
Yep.
It's funny you say that because we met so many people who would come to Kenya, even just for visits. And they would speak in a fashion which suggested they knew they were just visiting or that they were only there for a brief period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But the people would pick up on it right away. And it created a wall between them and the people that they were trying to serve. So I think one thing that we learned in our ministry early on is wherever we go, we're there.
Yeah.
And we are completely committed to that place. We cheer for their basketball team.
Yeah.
We believe it's the greatest place in the world. And only when you do that can you really have an impact on people's lives because they know that you love them.
Yeah. Yeah. Similar advice is given to just working with kids is you have to be very genuine because
Absolutely.
they see it immediately.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Normally we talk about a resource, but today for youth culture, but today we're going to mix it up. And because a new generation of officers are getting commissioned now, the millennial generation is getting commissioned and has been getting commissioned for a couple years now.
Yes.
And now several generations have come and gone through training school, and with every generation comes disruption because there's a different kind of mentality, a different way of growing up. How is the Army changing with a new generation of officers being commissioned?
Well, I think you make a key point there when you say that every generation changes.
Mm-hmm.
The Salvation Army's training process has changed over the course of its history. I think today we are more willing to consider specialization than we have been in the past. Individuals will say, I have a particular set of gifts, a particular set of abilities, so the Salvation Army is adjusting to that in terms of its continuing education for officers. The training that they'll receive at the college will be generic by nature, so as to prepare them for anything. But then after 5 years of service, we have 9 tracks that an individual can pursue to develop their skills, thereby improving the effectiveness of the Salvation Army in those 9 areas.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the key ways in which we adapt to a generation which is more conscious of the need for specialized training if you want to succeed in certain areas.
Yeah. Yeah, and managing and leading a new generation brings its challenges as well.
It does. Certainly the millennial generation has skills and abilities that my generation did not. They have attitudes and approaches that are better than the generation that I grew up with. On the other hand, there are things that I think as a baby boomer, our generation had an advantage in. But that simply comes with the territory. You simply accept that. You recognize that God's call is the same, and you adjust as an organization so as to fulfill that mission with people who have different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. This podcast is going to be focusing on disruption, and we're talking a little bit about disruption with generational change. And the early days of the Salvation Army, it was full of disruptors.
Yes.
And it was some of the stories seem very cavalier, just like free for all of the Salvation Army. And you are a Salvation historian. You know a lot about the early days of the Salvation Army. Which disruptive moment that you studied, read about, that you could look at being a great moment of change for the Army?
Okay. First of all, let me say it's a delight to be speaking with you about this today, because you'll recall that one of the things that I did early on when we came to this appointment was to make you the head of the disruptors.
Yes, and I appreciated that.
It's important to always have that element of disruption in any organization. If you look back to history, I think that there are a couple of examples of how the Salvation Army has dealt with disruption. First, if I may, I'd like to define what I understand disruption to be.
Please do.
So that we understand this. Disruption, in my mind, is an acceleration or a reinforcement of adaptive change. Change happens.
Yeah.
But change can be incremental in terms of a new technological tool to achieve what you're already doing. or change can be adaptive, that you have to change what you're doing, regardless of the tool that's involved. Disruption, in my mind, is a point at which that adaptive change has suddenly been accelerated, and that has forced the organization to do things that it may have already intended to do, but according to a different timeline.
Yeah.
If you look at the history of the Salvation Army, therefore, a couple of things. First, in William Booth's own life. William Booth, when he was a young man, was convinced that he should do something about the state of individuals physically. He was a Chartist. He grew up in Nottingham, and the Chartist movement was one which campaigned for social reform. He found that that was unsatisfactory, that society wasn't responsive. So as General John Larson describes it, he shifted his focus to helping people in eternal terms, and he shifted toward an emphasis upon salvation of the soul. But when William Booth had done that for several years, and in the late 1870s came to the conclusion that the Industrial Revolution had changed things so much that it was now possible to do something about people's physical circumstances, he wrote the book that we all recognize today as the key descriptor of the integrated mission of the Salvation Army. That's In Darkest England and The Way Out. When he wrote that book, he was bringing together what he knew, which was spiritual salvation, and matching it with something he'd always wanted to do and now found an opportunity to put into action. That was a key moment of disruption for the Salvation Army, because until that point, it had been directed toward eternal issues, toward spiritual salvation. But that book comes out, and as a consequence, the Salvation Army expands its whole perspective. The second moment of disruption that I think I really find significant as a historian is a disruption that comes internally. The Industrial Revolution was an external force.
Yeah.
But in the Salvation Army internally, in the High Council of 1929, experienced disruption as a consequence of internal factors. And that was that William Booth's son, Bramwell, becomes the general. He becomes ill. In the late 1920s, after society has moved a long way in terms of how it organizes its institutions, the Salvation Army internally is uncomfortable with the notion that Bramwell Booth would be able to simply write a little letter, seal it in an envelope, and declare who his successor was going to be. That's simply not the way it was going to be done. So the Salvation Army internally had to go through a very difficult time in which it jettisoned that mode of selecting the leader of the Salvation Army in favor of a High Council form of election. Very disruptive. And yet in both the first instance that I mentioned and in the High Council example, they were critically important. If we had not, as a Salvation Army, committed ourselves to the integrated mission, I'm convinced we would not have the impact on the millions of lives that we do today. And if we had not changed the way that we select our general, I'm also convinced that we would probably be a small sect of the Christian church which had this notion of father passing to son constantly. And there are examples of that we see today. But can you imagine the Salvation Army reaching as many or being as respected as it is with that kind of a model? I don't think I can.
Yeah.
So disruptions are uncomfortable. They are challenging, but ultimately they present enormous opportunity. And right now, I think we're in another one of those moments.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Forced.
Forced.
But yeah, certainly.
Absolutely. Think of, again, in the Army context, World War I defined the Salvation Army's relationship with the American public in terms of the donut.
Yeah.
That was reinforced in the Depression, and it was reinforced in World War II. The World War II generation has now largely passed into history. This is a moment at which the Salvation Army can be introduced to an entirely new generation of Americans. People are coming to our drive-through food events, and I've spoken with them. I've done this here in Southern California, who never imagined that they would ever come to the Salvation Army for service, who have no idea what the Salvation Army is. But they will never forget that the Salvation Army helped them.
Yeah.
They've learned more about who we are and what we do. It's a moment of renewal that I think 10, 15, 20 years down the road, if we take advantage of it, the Salvation Army will be able to help even more people for decades to come.
Yeah. Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this before, the recording of kind of those touch points and how impactful that will be, and we'll probably see reactions from this for years, and I mean maybe generations.
Oh, absolutely. And think of, Jim, you're familiar, and I think we've talked on the broadcast before about The Way Out.
Yep.
We committed ourselves last year to doubling our impact on homelessness in the western United States. As a consequence of COVID-19, with the cities and states and counties that have come to the Salvation Army and said, please, can you help us find safe, secure places for all these people who are living on our streets? The acceleration in our timeline as a consequence of this is going to help us have a bigger impact on the problem we already knew was there than we ever could have hoped for otherwise.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned how we're kind of dealing with disruption now. So much of the early Salvation Army was some of the disruption changed culture, changed legislations and stuff like that. And do you think, besides kind of the reactionary disruption that we're going with right now, do you think the Salvation Army is still a disruptive organization? I mean, it was really, really disruptive early on.
It was very disruptive, and there was a lot of experimentation that went on. The Match Factory is an example of experimentation. Our efforts in terms of fighting against what they referred to as modern slavery, which we understand to be child abuse and the selling of children. The Army was very, very involved in disrupting things then. As organizations age, it becomes more difficult for them to be change agents in the sense that you're referring.
Yeah.
That's not a unique situation for the Salvation Army. It's true of any organization that we would refer to as a legacy organization, I think. The key is that when moments like this come, what happens? Do we continue on the same route, or do we see opportunities to change things around? And I would like to think that locally and through the different territories and indeed around the world, that the way society changes now is going to prompt the Salvation Army to be interested in things that it might not have focused on in the past, that it will be more sensitive to and perhaps even more aggressive in pursuing issues that it knew about but didn't have the capabilities to do. I think the potential, therefore, is there. Whether or not we live up to it is something that only history will reveal.
Sure. I always think like, there was a period where in the youth ministry world, this is probably about 10 years ago, where it was a trend to really honor kind of the people in the past of Liza Shirley, Joe the Turk, and all these Brangle. And but I always laugh with like Joe the Turk, because that was like a real popular one because he was avant-garde and stuff. And he made some significant changes. He disrupted a lot of the Salvation Army and a lot of around him. But I was like, if Joe the Turk was around here now, he would be booted. He'd be like, that guy is crazy.
There's an argument to be made that William Booth couldn't last as an officer today. He
yes.
himself, in the way that he approached things.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right.
And so yeah, it is funny how over time it's maybe more protective of the greater organization, and people like Joe the Turk may have not had a place ultimately in the current Salvation Army.
But that is why there must constantly be a disruptive element. Lockheed does the same thing with their skunk works. They literally have a department that is dedicated to disrupting the way things are done. That is something that I think is going to be important for the Salvation Army going forward. I try to listen to those voices here. I hope to listen to those voices at national headquarters.
Yeah.
It's important to do. Otherwise, we're not re-examining ourselves constantly.
Yeah.
And we're missing out on opportunities as a result.
Yeah, and that's just great leadership advice as well, is reassessing ourselves and taking a look
Constantly.
and having to make those changes.
Yes.
Disruption is often uncomfortable. More than not, it's uncomfortable, particularly if you are a person who likes structure, order, and security, and any type of disruption could throw you off. And like one of my kids is like that. If you throw the schedule off, he's like, what is going on? But it gets especially uncomfortable and emotional with sacred cows. And every organization has sacred cows. We have sacred cows. And but how do you lead in a time when disruption's good or bad? Because sometimes they're good disruptions, everyone's on board. Sometimes it's bad news, something major happens. How do you lead when they're threatening not just the sacred cows, but the Army culture as a whole?
Right. Well, you use the key word, culture. I don't care how good your strategy is. Culture will eat strategy for breakfast.
Okay.
Culture will overcome any kind of strategy you have. You can have the best plan in the world to change things for the better, and if people don't buy into it from a cultural perspective, you're lost. It won't happen. It won't take. So I think the best way to lead in a moment of disruption is to have the strategy, but be constantly aware of the culture and how you can get the culture to move toward acceptance of the strategy. That's going to mean a lot of conversations with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And you're not going to convince them based upon the elements of the strategy itself. You're going to convince them based upon the values that the culture has lifted up. In the Salvation Army, you can have a marvelous plan to change the way a portion of the Salvation Army works. But unless you're able to convince those who are going to be affected, and even those who aren't going to be affected, that it is consistent with what the Salvation Army was born to do, and the way it was born to shake things up, as we've already said, you're not going to get there. You must also secondarily recognize that you will never convince everyone.
Yeah.
You just won't.
Yeah.
Leading in a time of change will always involve loss. There will always be people who simply don't feel that that's right, and they may choose not to remain with the institution or the organization involved, even the Salvation Army, because they feel it's not consistent with what they understood the Army to be.
Yeah.
But that should not stop the leader from taking those actions that he or she believes are the best to fulfill those fundamental cultural values.
Yeah. You mentioned culture. How do you measure, like, if a culture is good or bad? Like, if it's a toxic culture that people, from the outside it's toxic culture, but inside they think, oh, this works. How do you kind of sift through that as a leader?
Well, I think I want to make sure that the terms that we use here are consistent.
Okay.
I understand cultural values to always be positive ones. If there is any toxicity in the culture, then that should be eliminated regardless of whether or not you're changing strategies. So I will always, at least I will always try to consult as many people as possible. If there is toxicity to be addressed, usually that's based upon a misunderstanding, or it's based upon an individual who's not in the right position.
Mm-hmm.
Deal with that directly.
Mm.
It has to be dealt with directly, because if it's not, then any other changes you want to make consistent with the positive cultural values is going to be doomed from the beginning.
Yeah, and dealing with it promptly is significant.
And in a definitive fashion, yes.
Yeah, I think sometimes our insecurities will stand in the way and allow things to happen and just hope that they'll just go away. But if the reality is, if it's toxic, it's not going away, and you have to deal with it, and you can't leave it to somebody else.
The change always requires confrontation. You hope that it's not a negative confrontation, but it always does involve confronting a predisposition and a mindset.
Yeah, personally too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And an individual, many times, people have said to me on many occasions, I understand precisely what you're trying to do, but I just don't feel right about it.
Mm-hmm.
So you will know it's not an intellectual issue. It's entirely an emotional issue. It's a mindset issue.
Yeah.
And that's what you work with. And that's what you put your primary focus on as a leader. White papers and steps for implementation mean nothing if you haven't already dealt with those other issues.
Yeah. The current crisis that we are weathering is no doubt a major disruption. We talked a little bit about it, but it's not just to our organization; it's to the world, and things are going to look different when this is pandemic, shelter at home, all that stuff is kind of done. So in many ways, the Army will never be the same. Is this a good thing? What does the Army look like next year? Do we function the same when this is over?
Okay. It's a wonderful question. First, I should say that in my judgment, there is no organization that can better address the range of human needs generated by this crisis than the Salvation Army.
Yeah.
Our integrated mission, which takes the physical and the spiritual and the psychological and the emotional and says it's all worth our attention and our effort to address, is something that most organizations simply have no concept of. They are either directed toward mental health, or they're directed toward food delivery, or they're directed toward housing. Salvation Army says it's part of the whole person.
Yeah.
Let us address the needs of the whole person. So I think we are perfectly positioned. This is one reason, as I say earlier, that we had this moment of renewal, this moment where we can touch in a lot of ways. What will it do to the structure of the Salvation Army? I think it will accelerate a lot of the changes that are already underway.
Mm-hmm.
We have been changing the way the adult rehabilitation centers operate. The adult rehabilitation centers operated previously according to a model which assumed that we had a monopoly on the thrift store market.
Yeah. No more.
No more. The Salvation Army was the first to do it, but we are by far not alone. We're no longer alone in that
Right.
in that space. So how do we modify the system and the way we did our ARC ministry, our Adult Rehabilitation Centers ministry, to adapt to that? That requires internal restructuring. That requires a more strategic means of identifying the locations for our stores and how we function. It means bringing in more outside advice than we have had before. The Salvation Army, as a consequence of what's happened in this crisis, is going to be different because that process will have accelerated. We had to shut down all of our stores.
Yeah.
We had to furlough a large number of employees.
Right.
Reopening is going to be different by necessity.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, sometimes this, we talked a little bit about with this crisis is that it does force these changes or accelerates the changes,
That's
as you're
right.
saying. And then with those changes, bring on other changes. And so it's not a short-term process. This is a very long-term while the disruption may happen and things accelerate fast, it's still a very long-term process.
There are a lot of ripples.
Yeah. As a leader, when do you feel like it's a good time to push for disruption or embrace it? Like, is it something that we should always be pushing for disruption and embracing it, or is there a time to pull it back and to say we gotta kind of stay the course right now?
You have to do that. You have to learn the balance. One cannot constantly disrupt. The human spirit is not made to tolerate it. There has to be some sense of stability.
Yeah.
Ronald Heifetz wrote something on one occasion that I've always found very useful. He said that sometimes leadership is a matter of disappointing your people at a rate that they can absorb. You have to give people a sense that there is something on which they can base their actions and their expectations. But then you look for those moments, and you're aware of those moments when perhaps a small change or a large change is appropriate. And usually you'll find more than one factor pointing towards the need to pursue it. More than one person will mention it to you. It'll have a significant financial impact. You're not meeting the programmatic need.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the moments that you push. But never forget, people need a solid understanding. They need to know that they know what's going on.
Yeah, that's important. There needs to be a sense of stability with that. I think some people, because disruption is really kind of, the word has been trendy for the past 10 years, and
Yes.
people are like, oh, we should upset everything. And trust me, I'm all for upsetting and changing culture and changing our ways and trying to be more relevant. But there also needs to be this level of stability because, like you said, as an employee, there's only so much change that I could deal with.
Absolutely.
And I laugh because, like, some people will read millions of leadership books and just keep pounding them over and over again. And so then you don't know what leader's showing up because they've just read something else and have shifted everything, and it's chaos the whole time.
That's right.
And so you lose that stability, and you're like, can you just stay to book number 3? That seemed to work. Like, we like book number 3. Book number 5 is not very cool. Can you stop doing that? You know?
That's true.
And it just I love the idea of keep pushing forward and looking at the opportunity for disruption, but also keeping
don't
that
pursue
stability.
it just for its own sake.
Yeah, and it's not. There's people that like to be avant-garde or edgy just to be edgy. That might be funny for a little while, but it's not. There's no sense of kind of stableness through all of that.
It's
And
exhausting.
it is. It's tiring, and you'll run into burnout, which is a whole separate podcast altogether.
Yes, that's right.
When presented with an idea that could cause a disruption in either the business or kind of the culture of the Army, what's your working process and how to move forward with that?
I have internal and external advisors.
Mm-hmm.
Internally, I will always consult with the team at territorial headquarters, but I will always consult with retired senior leaders who've been there before. I will seek to consult with soldiers. So internally, you always check with your different constituencies. Externally, you do the same through our advisory organizations. It's very unwise to pursue any sort of disruption or any sort of change unless you have at least acquainted everyone with the issue. They might disagree, but they're informed.
Yeah.
And the worst kind of disruption is disruption that is a surprise to people.
Yeah.
They haven't had a chance to get their arms around it.
Yeah.
So I think the most important thing is to discuss.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned retired officers. I think for some reason we think when people retire, they've retired their brain. And
Yes, that's true.
it's not. That's crazy. It's ludicrous.
That's
and I always tell youth workers all the time, I go, talk to your retired people. they still want to do stuff.
And they have an enormous amount of wisdom.
Yeah.
They might not know the latest tool that's been made available by our computers,
Right.
but they understand human nature,
Yeah.
and they understand the way people think. That's very helpful.
Yeah, and there's nothing worse than seeing a person that's older and wiser than you laughing at you, making mistakes that you could have just asked.
Yeah.
And they're like, if you would have asked me, I would have told you. And that's the worst case scenario.
Yeah, that's
You're like, you mean I could have saved all this if I would have just asked you? Yeah, we were just sitting back laughing and watching you. On my honeymoon, I was trying to pack our car. We were staying in Yosemite, and I was trying to pack our car, and I clearly packed it just one way. And I could not figure out how to get it one way to get all of our stuff in, because we brought all our own food and all that stuff.
Sure.
And this old guy was just laughing at me the entire time. And he was sitting up on the porch at the hotel. I was like, finally, I go, did I do something? Because it was kind of annoying me. I was getting agitated. And he goes, no, that was just me and my wife 30 years ago. And on our honeymoon, doing the exact same thing that you did. And he goes, if you would have asked for my advice, I would have said, just pack less. It's far less stressful,
right.
And make it worthwhile, and you'll survive. You'll be fine. But I always laugh thinking about that, and kind of annoyed that he was laughing at me. But my plan is to go back and laugh at someone else.
And that's right. It's a good plan.
When disruption or change is happening naturally within the organization, or even in a core setting, so it's just maybe the surrounding of the core is changing, the demographics of the core is changing. Things are just changing naturally, and that happens. Sometimes disruption is just man-made. This is what we're going to do, and sometimes it's just this gradual disruption of change. How do you work with people or even leadership that can't seem to embrace it and want it a certain way?
That is a very important question. A leader has to be ready when the moment is right to cut the institution's losses and say, I'm sorry, but we simply have to go in a different direction here.
Yeah.
All of what I've already said about discussion and sharing and consultation applies. But there will be those instances which, usually for reasons beyond your control, you have to make a decision one way or the other. And that's when the loss occurs. That's what's painful about leadership. But it's the leader's responsibility.
Yeah, and all kinds of feelings come up with that. Is you mostly exposes a lot of your own insecurities of you don't want people to not like you and you're trying to appease everybody. Is there a time when, that you get to a space and just say this isn't for you?
As a leader?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose you can. You can get to that point and you can say that. But I think you will always regret it if you give in to that. I think that when God calls you to a certain place and to a certain role, you fulfill it to the best of your ability, and having done so, live with the results. I think for a leader to say, this is just too much for me, I can't do this anymore, that's an extraordinary decision, and one which, based upon the individuals that I know who have done that, one that can easily be regretted over the years.
Yeah. I've also wondered, like with kind of tough decisions that officers would be faced with, like something like this, where it happens naturally, and because of officers move, they don't always have to see the repercussions. Do you think that changes the decision-making process a lot?
It can.
Yeah.
It can. An individual, if they don't feel they're going to have to live with the results, would be more likely to start making dramatic changes.
Yeah.
One thing to combat that is to lengthen the stays for individuals in their various roles. This year, as you probably know, Jim, we reduced the percentage of officers moved to about 15% of our officers. So our goal is to have officers in place for at least 5, usually 6 years. That gives you plenty of time to make dramatic change, to see tremendous results, to see the fruits of your labor, to give some stability to the relationships that you develop both in the Corps and in the community. And it also lowers the tendency perhaps to act precipitously.
Yeah. I was fascinated with my in-laws when they were graduating, when they were retiring. I guess it's a graduation in a sense, but
Yeah.
saying that their longest appointment was their final appointment
Yes.
that they had, which I thought was incredibly odd. It's probably a statistic rarity, but they were grateful for that because they said that they got to see some of the outcomes of some of the decision-making process that they made, and had to see the emotion of that on the bad side of it as well, and not just the good side. It's easy for us to always look at the good side, but the bad side of having to deal with that, and how that had an impact on them. And so when you see the good and the bad, how do you react to the bad part of that disruption?
You feel it.
Mm-hmm.
You're human. You understand it, but you have no time for grudges. So you forgive any comments that might be made that might be unkind or perhaps not fully understood. You continue to love everyone that you're working with, and you simply leave it there and move on.
Okay. Do you have a disruptive idea that could change the Army that you've always wanted to do? I got 30 personally. But I just want one from you. That's
you just
all.
Want one. Well, I toyed around with the question that you were kind enough to share with me in that regard. I think the one that I have always wanted to do is to help us rediscover those early days of the Salvation Army. And the way out is one that I think can help us do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that my wife and I will want to watch from a distance when we take up our new appointments is how that plays out here in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Because the way out is a means by which the Salvation Army can say, we were born on the streets. We're dealing with the streets, those at the very bottom of society. It's not issues associated with a megachurch. It's not about a comfortable Christianity. It's about sacrifice. It's about dedication. It's about perseverance. It's about courage. It's about giving up things that you've always thought you wanted to do because there's someone whose life is at rock bottom. That's the kind of project that I would like to see through to fruition. Now, we'll have lots of wonderful opportunities at National Headquarters, and we're looking forward to all of them. But one thing that we will always want to monitor and think about is that project.
Yeah.
Because that, for me, has always been a dream, to reestablish that fundamental sense of what we call salvationism, which I think over time, over decades, can easily be lost in an organization or in a church, and it becomes staid. I think this effort has presents the opportunity to reinvigorate that whole concept.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what the way out looks like 10 years from now,
Me too.
15 years from now, and just some of the stories that have come through on that, I think will be significant. It is a disruption, and it's changed a lot of how we've been thinking on things, and that's a good thing. And I think, we've talked about it. It's we have to think through these things and process these things and see the greater good beyond of what we're doing. And good things come when that happens, when you get to that space of like what's best for the organization.
Absolutely. It's not about us.
Yeah.
It's about what God has called us to. And I pray constantly that the Lord will reaffirm that in my mind, and it's what I want for all Salvationists and everyone who's a part of this mission. I want us all to share that, because that is what will make us powerful
Yeah.
for the Lord.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Commissioner, for joining us, or joining me, actually, and in this way. And thank you for supporting us in the youth department and being willing to do this kind of stuff and talk about tough topics.
Jim, I'm so grateful
appreciate
for
it.
the opportunity to be with you. What you and your colleagues do, you live disruption all the time, and you do a great deal of good for the kingdom as a result. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate it. Thank you. If you are interested in any of the resources that we have talked about, which is the Way Out book, I'll put a link in that because some people have not heard of the Way Out book. And
It's a great book.
the look of disappointment on your face was significant when I said that. But I'll put a link in for that as well. And don't forget to subscribe to the Sade Network podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and on YouTube as well under Sade Network. We'll have a new episode next week because we don't repeat episodes. I don't know why it's in the script. We always say there will be a new episode next week because there is, and that's what we do. So don't forget that every Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m., we've been doing youth group on Facebook. Check it out. It's been a lot of fun. Today is episode. We talk about art, creativity, and it's a lot of fun. And so check it out on Facebook. Commissioner, thank you again. And we wish you and Commissioner Jolene the best at National Headquarters. Enjoy the, I think, poppy trees. Is that it? And in Washington, D.C., the white trees.
The cherry trees.
Cherry blossoms.
Cherry blossoms, yes.
That will be significant. There's also snow there.
That's true.
You'll have to deal with that.
That's true.
And,
We'll make a snowman. That's right.
Yeah, and you'll have to deal with the fact that you're not looking out at the beach.
Oh,
So deal with
yes.
that, pal. I don't even know what the National Commander's Office looks like, but
I'm not sure either. But I don't think it's the ocean.
I bet it's the little highway that's right outside.
That's probably true.
Really, really exciting to see all those Uber cars driving back and forth for you. So thank you again. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you guys next week. Goodbye, everybody.
God bless you, Jim. Thank you.